Welcome back to the Liz Wheeler Show. We are now 39 days until the presidential election. Of all the diabolical globalist plans to take over our country, our families, our lives, the United Nations has a plot that really takes the cake. They call it Agenda 2030, and it is as sinister as if real-life supervillains themselves conceived it. In fact, in New York City just this week, members of the United Nations gathered at what they call the Summit for the Future. The purpose of the Summit for the Future was to sign a document they call the Pact for the Future. The purpose of this Pact for the Future is to make Agenda 2030 a reality all over the world. Now, to call Agenda 2030 diabolically may be unfair. At least the devil has not been able to entirely take over our world. But the United Nations, led by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is sure going to give global takeover the old college try. And we're going to talk about exactly how they're going to carry out this plan today on the show. Let's get started with a prayer. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl through the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. The sponsors for today's show are Crowd Health. This is one of my favorites because health insurance is confusing, it's expensive, it's really frustrating. Claim denials are becoming more and more common. You've probably experienced this. I have. In fact, 1 in 5 Obamacare claims were denied last year. That is unacceptable. The headache of health insurance is exactly why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. I personally cannot stand dealing with health insurance at all, but with Crowd Health, it's a totally different experience. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you will get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, so much more without doctors' networks getting in your way. And of course, you'll join the crowd, a group of members just like you and me who want to help pay for each other's unexpected medical events without being beholden to insurance companies. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com. Joincrowdhealth.com. Promo code Liz. Mandatory disclaimer here, Crowd Health is not insurance, but you can learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. Now, the radical left keeps talking about court reform. You've heard Joe Biden himself or Joe Biden's mouthpieces discuss it. These radical leftists want to eliminate the court's conservative majority by packing the Supreme Court with their own handpicked justices in order to get the political outcomes that they want. President Biden is taking a role in this. He's gotten in on the act by making reforming the court one of his final priorities before he leaves office. But don't be fooled, my friends. Their end game is really just court packing. At First Liberty, they call this assault on the court what it really is, a Supreme Court coup. They want to eliminate the court's conservative majority. They want their own outcomes. They want to pack the court to achieve that. The frightening thing is that come January, their plan could become our nation's reality. Simple majority votes in the House and the Senate combined with the president's signature could turn their plan to pack the court into law. But right now, if we unite our voices, you and I, if we take action together, we can put a stop to the radical left's plan to take control of the Supreme Court. The future of the court, of preserving an independent judiciary, is literally in our hands. If we lose the court, we will lose the country. That's why we're taking action, and we need you to join us. With 1 million patriots like you standing for the Supreme Court, we can safeguard the independence of the judiciary, just as the Founding Fathers intended. And saying no to the left's Supreme Court coup, we can secure the blessings of liberty and protect the future of our constitutional rights for our children and our children's children. Go to supremecoup.com/Liz. That's supremecoup.com/Liz to learn how you can help stop the radical left's takeover of the Supreme Court. So Agenda 2030 is so sinister. It may be exactly why the mainstream media and Kamala Harris and even Hillary Clinton lately have been trotting out lies about Project 2025, accusing Donald Trump of supporting what they're falsely portraying to be a scary, totalitarian takeover of our lives. Project 2025, by the way, is no such thing. It's a wonky, nerdy, 900-page policy paper that was written by a think tank. in an attempt to organize all the bureaucrats and the executive agencies to be more efficient. So scandalous, so tyrannical, right? To organize government workers so they don't waste our money? The horror! I read a lot of the 900-page document to see what all the fuss was about, and it's super boring. I talked with the Project 2025 folks. Also boring. You probably saw that meme that was going around a couple of weeks ago on social media claiming Project 2025 was going to do everything from ban divorce to who even knows what else. None of what's on that meme is true. It's just outright lies. You don't have to take my word for it. You can do a Control F on the Project 2025 document. Look it up. See what you find. You'll see for yourself. The left, of course, hopes that you won't do that. But all of that is actually a moot point because Donald Trump has never embraced Project 2025. Trump says, I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know what it is. The Project 2025 narrative from the left was always intended to be a distraction from the reality of Agenda 2030. The official title of Agenda 2030 is Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. First of all, anytime the left says transforming our world is a red flag. But the title here is of particular importance because remember, James Lindsay was among the first to identify sustainability as being a code word for policies that promote a hidden ESG agenda. That's environmental, social, and governance guidelines. Now, ESG hides DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements. Not diversity and equity and inclusion the way that you or I might define it, but diversity meaning tokenism or racial discrimination. Equity meaning not equal opportunity, but equal outcome, which is just socialism that has to be dictated by someone. And inclusion does not mean tolerance. Inclusion is essentially religious persecution. You will include the trans agenda, which means you will adhere to it. The result of ESG, whether it's applied to our financial systems, woke corporations, our schools, the result of it is communism. Now, terms like sustainability have been used by the World Economic Forum, for example, about the Great Reset. They're deceptive euphemisms. And I think a lot of us understand that, intended to camouflage the dark reality of totalitarianism. And the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is no exception to this rule. The ultimate goal of globalists, like those who run the UN, is consolidated power. It's not enough for them to have a loving family and friends and community, to have their name on the office door, to be the boss even, to run the company, to own a nice piece of real estate, or even to serve as the Secretary General of the United Nations. No. They want everything. They want to control you. From the moment you wake up and do your required morning land acknowledgement, eat your breakfast of lab-grown meat, hitchhike to your job on the urban collective since you're now prohibited from owning property and suburbs no longer exist, drop off the one child you've been permitted to have, as long as you never speak to her about religion, to the universal daycare program you're required to send her, until you go to bed at dark since fossil fuels are banned, so there's no electricity and you can't see after sunset. And you're sick anyway because there aren't medications to save your life since petrochemicals have been banned too. And you can't eat nourishing food to keep your body healthy because Bill Gates' disgusting genetically manipulated soy burger tastes like poison. I wish I was making any of that up. The goal of the Pact for the Future is to remake the United Nations, taking it from the UN to the UN 2.0, with the ultimate goal of executing Agenda 2030's ideological agenda. UN 2.0 is what they want. Bigger, more powerful, in control of everything. And I mean everything. We're going to get back to that point in just a moment. This is how the Pact for the Future works. There are 11 total policy proposals within the Pact for the Future, combined with the especially significant UN Global Digital Compact and the Emergency Platform. The former was also adopted this week in New York. The latter was kicked down the road a little bit, but the latter is of particular importance. The so-called Emergency Platform grants sweeping powers to the Secretary General of the United Nations in the event of a complex global shock. What is a complex global shock? Well, the UN defines complex global shocks as events that, quote, have severely disruptive and adverse consequences for a significant proportion of countries in the global population. Such events would then necessitate a, quote, multi-dimensional, multi-stakeholder, and whole of government, whole of society response. Literally every single phrase is a red flag. The UN, of course, would play a central role here in the event of a complex global shock. A, quote, coordinated and multidimensional international response will be necessary and would be, quote, the central role of the United Nations 2.0. So basically, the UN makes up the definition of what an emergency is. And then under the vague guise of one of these emergencies, they give themselves power, so-called global governing power. Their words, not mine. So if a shock happens, voila, UN 2.0 claims sweeping powers, including telling countries around the world what to do. Or as they say, presenting to the member states protocols for convening and operationalizing emergency platforms based on flexible approaches to respond to a range of different complex global shocks. I can distill that into just one word for them: control. The UN remakes itself. That's the goal of this summit for the future, this pact for the future, which they adopted. The US is now part of this. They finally admitted that they want more power, more globalist power. They give themselves more power using these euphemisms to disguise their agenda so that member states don't protest. Most people in member states, like the United States, don't even know about this. Then once they have more power, they define the type of emergency they'd like to happen. And once they make that happen, that triggers more powers, emergency powers, to the UN to control our lives. I'm not exaggerating. I wish I was. Under the Global Digital Compact portion of the Pact for the Future, which was adopted this week in New York, they call for digital IDs connected to our bank accounts, digital currency, novel vaccine technologies, drones to monitor how much water people are using, and of course, a government-regulated digital infrastructure, which is a euphemism for tightly controlled speech, abounding with censorship if you or I dare dissent from this. Of course, they have the tools to make it hurt if you manage to evade the censors for a moment and speak your mind. And by the way, the Secretary General of the United Nations openly admits that they seek to reset the global financial system, usher in what appears to be a new world reserve currency that is controlled by the global government. They seek to redistribute wealth from people like us in prosperous countries to poor ones, as long as the poor countries accept the leftist ideology that comes with our money, and unfortunately, so much more. With me now is a man who has spent almost more time diving into this, educating himself on this plot to take over the world than anyone else I know. He is a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, Justin Haskins. All right, with me now is senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, Justin Haskins. Justin, I know you've done a lot of research into this. You've been warning us about Agenda 2030 for a long time, maybe one of the first voices to, ring that bell. Can you walk us through some of the stuff in here? Because it is easy to, in a sense, dismiss this because it's so convoluted and it's so extreme that people are like, well, that's never actually going to happen.
Yeah, this has been something that's been going on for a long, long time. Agenda 2030 is the successor to Agenda 21, which got a lot of publicity back in the day. All of this is a trend in the United Nations trying to have increasingly more power over national sovereignty in the West. And this is something that the Biden administration is a huge supporter of. Kamala Harris, obviously a big supporter of this. Back in the day, Barack Obama and VP Biden were big supporters of all of these policies. And this has just been going on for a long time. So the big thing driving Agenda 2030 are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. And they cover all sorts of things, sort of general topics. For example, zero hunger is one of them. No poverty is another one. Gender equality, climate change is one. Clean water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these different sustainable development goals have within them specific, more specific targets, which are really where the meat is behind all of these things. Now, some of this is obviously not problematic at all, right? Everyone's for clean water. Like, who could be against that, right? But And even things like gender equality sound good on the surface, obviously. But then when you start diving into what these things are, in reality, this is just a global push for left-wing policies. That's all it is, from radical climate change type policies to, things like reversing biodiversity, which is a real thing. I don't know exactly how you do that, but that's one of the things that's in here, to wealth redistribution and global tax policies, and all kinds of crazy stuff is embedded within this. But they all have one thing in common, and that is to make the United Nations significantly more powerful, to move the Western world toward a UN European-centered government, essentially. Eventually, I think a one world government is what they're going for here, or at least a Western government, one Western government. And that's what all of these things have in mind. And they wrap them up in these really nice sounding, clean water and sanitation and gender equality and no poverty. But in reality, this is about increasing the power of government, both national governments and international governments.
So what I find particularly deceptive and malicious, sinister, is that most of these things, as you mentioned, actually sound great. I would be 100% on board with a realistic policy that's pro-humanity, that there was zero hunger, zero starvation, or clean water for everyone. But the deceptive part is that they sell us on these goals, and then underneath these goals are, as you said, it's basically a mask for not just leftist policies, but basically communist policies. Can you give us a direct example? Because what I want to do today, it's very easy to talk about this stuff in big picture way and like the highfalutin way, like, oh, this is a globalist thing. But I want people to be able to say, yes, the United Nations is trying to get more power. They're giving themselves more power. They are lying to us by saying that they want clean water and zero poverty, but actually underneath those SDGs, those sustainable development goals, here's what they're actually doing.
Yeah. There's tons and tons and tons of examples of this. Obviously, all of the people in America are very familiar with, the Green New Deal and the sort of socialistic, communistic nature of that. All of the climate objectives in the SDGs and the environmental objectives are very much in line with Green New Deal type policies, big, gigantic public infrastructure programs, forcing everybody to move away from gasoline-powered cars and natural gas and things like that, forcing everybody to put solar panels on their roof. Like, that's the long-term goal of all those things, driven by public finance. There's tons of language in the SDGs about, and in all UN documents lately, about increasing public financing for the developing world, especially Africa and Asia, financed by wealthier nations like the United States in particular, and Canada and European nations, et cetera. So
wait a second. Let me interrupt you for a second there, because that's one of those ones that I think is really deceiving. Because if you're like, oh, a developing nation needs more help, is there some way that we can help them? Explain to me exactly what this means, because it seems to me that this is a redistribution of wealth scheme where they want to take our money, because it's not like our nation has money. The people in our nation have money, and the government taxes people to use that money for things that they think it's okay to take our money and use it for. So they want to take our money and give it to third world nations. But how would the UN have the power to do this? Would it be something that they actually had control, where they could say, you have to do this, we require this? Or is it just a suggestion that we could voluntarily be like, nah, we don't want to do that?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different tactics that they use. For the most part, one tactic is they try very hard to coerce various Western nations to give increasingly more money to aid programs within the United Nations, which they then divert to developing countries, sometimes for good things, sometimes for very nefarious things, which we can get into. But that's part of it, is direct financing coming from countries. Now, they don't actually have the ability to go to the United States and say, you must give us X amount of money, or you're out, or, or we're going to, force you to do it or take you to court or something. They can't do that. So one of the really tricky ways they go about this is through reforms to international financial architecture. That's the language that they use in some of their more recent documents. That means World Bank, International Monetary Fund, other big sort of international banks and financial institutions. And so the United States is the primary funder of all of those things. They support and back all of those things with taxpayer dollars, and the Fed backs those things in a variety of different ways, directly and indirectly. And that money is really U.S. money. It's going to these world banks and things like that, which it then takes the money and diverts it to developing nations in places like Africa. It's sort of similar to, it really is in a lot of ways the counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which you may have heard of, which is a really nefarious long-term plan by China to develop a lot of these third world countries by giving them tons and tons and tons of money and labor and building mines in exchange for all these advantageous financial arrangements where they get to buy up a certain natural resource, China that is, or they get to have favors with various government officials. And so the West's answer to that really is the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and things like that, where we give all this cheap financing to low-income nations, or we pay for the development of infrastructure or things like that. In exchange, we get basically nothing other than the goodwill of these nations and hopefully drive them out of the arms of places like China. In the past, it was used against the Soviet Union and things like that. So that's been going on. Now, that you could argue makes some sense. Maybe that's a good foreign policy, right? But what they've done is they've tied all sorts of strings to the money. So it's not just, we're going to give you money, country in Africa, and you build roads. It's, you have to build the roads we want. You have to have the programs we want. You have to have the gender policies we want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this climate change stuff in Africa and places like that comes from Western money being tied to these African countries adopting Green New Deal like policies. It's not like they want those policies. It's just they need the money and we're willing to give it to them, but we're going to tie all these strings to it, just like we're doing in Ukraine with all sorts of things, to sort of push these countries to become significantly more progressive or socialistic. So it's a really nefarious scheme that on the surface seems like this goodwill charitable thing, but it's really not. It's a scheme to try to force the rest of the world to become more like left-wing European nations and, the Biden-Harris administration, essentially.
It sounds parasitic almost, because the idea that the World Bank is a counter to China trying to take advantage of these developing countries, as you said, doesn't sound necessarily all bad. It's like, okay, well, we don't want China to have control of the rest of the world besides the United States' physical land here. So we provide some kind of, it's a geopolitical maneuvering is what I would call it. But then the United Nations latches on like a parasite to that money and requires these nations to adopt these left-wing policies. But you mentioned the word sovereignty at the beginning, and I want to go back to that for a second, because this has been one of the accusations from people like me since I learned about Agenda 2030. I'm like, okay, this is a violation of U.S. sovereignty, especially when it comes to these, complex global shocks, they call them, essentially events that the UN would unilaterally declare to be an emergency, which would grant the UN emergency powers, which would allow them to, it seems to me, dictate to countries like the United States policies they would have to adopt in the case of a pandemic or something, saying this is the vaccine mandate you must implement. These are the social distancing mandates you must implement. These are the lockdown mandates you must implement. That in and of itself, if that is true, that is just a blatant and obvious, almost an elementary violation of sovereignty. Those who are supporters of Agenda 2030 claim that there is no violation of sovereignty because countries wouldn't have to comply. Is that true?
So for Agenda 2030 itself, countries don't necessarily have to comply. But Agenda 2030 is more of like a blueprint. And then there's all these international agreements that the United Nations enters into or puts into force, including the United States often is involved in this, that has actual teeth to it in varying degrees. That would be the implementation of the 2030 agenda into nations. So, for example, just this past week, we had the summit of the Future, okay, happen at the United Nations. And at the Summit of the Future, there were 3 international agreements that were kind of rolled into one that were approved. You had Pact for the Future, Declaration on Future Generations, and the Global Digital Compact. All of these things you can find if you look up Pact for the Future, if you're interested in learning more about that. All of these things were approved essentially unanimously by the United Nations. Secretary Blinken on Monday came out and said full-throated support for it, loves Pact for the Future, thinks this is great. There's the whole point of this, the stated purpose of it, this isn't me guessing, the stated purpose of this is to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, advanced Agenda 2030. That's the whole point of this. And there's all kinds of crazy things in Pact for the Future. One of them is a sort of a lighter version of what you just described, called the Emergency Platform. This was the proposal that was put forward by the UN Secretary General a few years back. He's been trying to get the United Nations to adopt it. Summit of the Future is when this thing was supposed to happen, and it would essentially give all of these crazy emergency powers to the UN Secretary General. I've been following this very closely, reading all the different draft texts and things like that. And all the way up until the last moment, there was text in there that talked about these emergency platforms and talked about the UN Secretary General moving that forward and getting closer to having these emergency protocols and powers. And then at the very last moment, right before they passed it, they changed the text and softened it a little bit, and didn't get rid of it entirely, but the idea is to kick the can down the road for that particular policy. But it's definitely something that's coming, and it is being moved forward by this Pact for the Future. There's a whole bunch of other crazy things that are in Pact for the Future, though, that weren't watered down, like all kinds of crazy climate objectives and things like that, mandates for tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030, which is not that far from now, getting rid of coal worldwide, phasing out fossil fuels, which of course means getting rid of your gasoline-powered cars.
And also talk about the implications of that, please, because that sounds so vague to people. They're just like, oh, well, Teslas are cool, electric vehicles are cool. Tell me what will actually happen in our lives here in the United States if we have a ban on fossil fuels.
It would be extreme poverty, to say the least. The wind and solar power, which is the main things that they want to replace fossil fuels with, are incredibly unreliable. They are very, very expensive relative to existing forms of electricity generation. You have to have the wind blowing or the sun shining for it to work. So in a lot of parts of the country, like in Minnesota and places like that, where it's cold, you don't necessarily have that opportunity for it to be efficient or effective. It requires massive infrastructure. You need to have huge amounts of land to have enough windmills and solar panels to produce enough energy to run the country. We're talking about land the size of whole states would have to be devoted entirely to this one thing. You would have tons of animals and natural habitats completely wiped out by this. You need whole new electricity lines all across the country to operate on this. You're talking about destroying all of the fracking jobs in the country, all of the millions of jobs related to fossil fuels, replacing every single or the vast majority of cars, over 95% of cars and trucks and things like that. Think of all the farm equipment that would have to be turned into electric equipment. We don't have the batteries for this. You have to go mine the rare earth minerals to produce the batteries to have these things. So you're talking about more destruction of our economy. We have no money to pay for any of this, obviously. And the cost of energy would skyrocket. And as the cost of energy skyrockets, as we've seen over the past 5 years or so under the Biden administration, when the cost of energy skyrockets, the price of everything skyrockets, because energy is tied to all goods and services in some fashion. And so we're talking about we're talking about millions of jobs lost, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of cost. When AOC proposed something like this, the Green New Deal, her version, not the Biden version, the cost of the Green New Deal was on the higher end, $90 trillion So there's no money for any of it. It would bankrupt the country. Just this one part. And we're just talking about one part of Pact for the Future.
And by the way,
there's a million other things in it.
By the way, that doesn't even take into account the textile industry. So all of your clothes are made using fossil fuels. I mean, think about polyester that's made from fossil fuels, from plastic. Think about every medication, every antibiotic that you've ever taken, that's all made from every big pharma product. As critical as I am of big pharma, they do a lot of life-saving work with medications. That's all made from petrochemicals. If you don't have fossil fuels, you have none of that. You don't have any capacity to sterilize surgical instruments. I mean, the real world impact in our lives, even if you're not a political person, even if you don't care about right wing versus left wing, even if you consider yourself an environmentalist, even if you're worried about climate change, this would be a disaster, the kind of which this world has never experienced.
No. And really, in a lot of ways, it's not possible because of how bad things would have to get us to that point. It's really not possible. And I think a lot of people on the left actually know that it's not possible, but they want the fundamental transformation of the economy and society by extension. And so they're advocating for these policies because it's a climate change, an existential crisis. This claim is a really good excuse to do all the things the left always wanted to do anyway. And so it's just this really diabolical long-term plan to transform our society by scaring everybody into believing that fossil fuels are the boogeyman, when in reality, you can make a really strong case that fossil fuels is one of the main reasons we have modern society in the first place, because of how reliable it is and how affordable it is and how all the uses that you mentioned, textiles and things like that, plastic. I mean, these things are all made from petrochemical, all of that stuff. Our entire modern way of life is built on affordable energy, which is provided by fossil fuels. So it is not a dirty word, fossil fuels. And fossil fuels have become increasingly cleaner over time. Natural gas is much cleaner than coal was. And so we've made lots of advancements in making energy cleaner. And if a more affordable energy source comes around that's even cleaner, great. Let's switch to that. But that's not what the left wants to do. What they want to do is impose it using these socialistic programs and sort of push us into it through these international agreements, because they can't get the laws passed here in the United States. So instead, they're trying to do this through the United Nations and imposing it on developing nations and things like that before we even do it here in the US.
Yeah, and Kamala Harris supports all of this. Every voter ought to know. Talk to me about the digital compact, because this is especially frightening, as a lot of us spend a lot of our time getting news from alternative media, the mainstream media being in the pocket of the left, actually propagandists for radical leftists, utter liars, an arm of the Kamala Harris campaign. Alternative media is incredibly important because the very idea of objective truth is under assault by the left. And this digital compact that I believe was adopted is a existential crisis to the fact that I don't want to go to jail for what I say. The people listening and watching the show don't want to go to jail for consuming this conversation, watching this, agreeing with this. But that's a very real threat under the standards of the digital compact.
Yeah, so the Global Digital Compact was approved. It's part of the Pact for the Future now. It was a standalone thing prior to that. Essentially, what it does is there's a whole bunch of things in the Global Digital Compact, but one of the biggest things it's trying to do is create a massive propaganda operation housed and supported at the United Nations, so that they can counter what they say is misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms and on digital media and on the internet generally. Of course, misinformation and disinformation is whatever, is anything that you don't agree with them on. So if you don't agree with them about vaccines, that's misinformation, disinformation. You don't agree to them about Agenda 2030, that's also misinformation and disinformation. And so that's how they've been using that. We know that from what happened with COVID, and there's a million other examples too. So some specifics that are in the Global Digital Compact. There's a clause in here. This is actual text from the Digital Compact. They want member nations, as part of this agreement, including the United States, agreed to create a safe and secure online space for all users that ensures their mental health and well-being by defining and adopting common standards. We're talking about common standards for the internet, guidelines and industry actions that are in compliance with international law, promote safe civic spaces, and address content on digital platforms that causes harm to individuals. Okay, so what the United States just signed up for is creating a global set of rules and guidelines for the internet that has left-wing, ideas embedded into it, content moderation, etc., so that we can have a safer internet experience. But of course, what that means in reality is silencing voices like yours and mine because they don't like what we have to say and they don't agree with us. Not only are they going to do that, they're also going to provide support for independent and public media and journalists and media workers that agree with them, obviously. They're going to provide, promote, and facilitate access to and dissemination of independent, fact-based, which is a joke, timely, targeted, clear, accessible, multilingual, and science-based, another joke, information to counter mis- and disinformation. So again, a propaganda effort.
It's a censorship regime
at the United Nations.
They just laid out a censorship regime.
Yes, that without any doubt whatsoever. Yes, it's been formally adopted as of this past week with the support of the United States of America. I mean, we've agreed to all of this. Not us, obviously, not the people, not the voters. They didn't even know this was happening. But the Biden-Harris administration signed us up for all of this. And they don't just have their eyes on the technology of the present. They have their eyes on the technology of the future. That's one of their main concerns. A huge chunk of this Global Digital Compact is devoted to global governance. That's the words they use, of artificial intelligence, which is going to be one of the main industries, one of the most, and probably the most influential industry in the world over the next 20, 30 years. They want to build a whole infrastructure of public-private partnerships with big tech companies, the United Nations, governments, to create rules to embed ESG policies into the design of artificial intelligence programs. They have a couple new groups they're creating. One's called the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI, which is a Orwellian title if there ever was one. A global dialogue on AI governance program. And with the explicit purpose that the Agenda 2030 that we had talked about before would be advanced by AI. They specifically say, we want AI to be designed to advance Agenda 2030. That's the whole point. Yeah. So the whole world just signed up for this, including the United States. And it's going to
impact us. And let me tell you how it's going to start, because I think we've already started to experience the frightening reality of what happens when you give away powers to AI. AI is often portrayed as this autonomous being, right? Artificial intelligence. We think of it as faceless. Just, it's one of the expert class, but not like a person, not an ideology. Even though we know it's biased, it's still this sort of nebulous idea. But what is going to happen, and what is already happening, because I've experienced this already, is if you have a problem with how something, say you go to an airline, this is a real life example. You go to an airline and you say, hey, I have the airline credit card, which allows me to have free bags, but for some reason you charge me for these bags and I want you to rescind the charge. I want you to refund me for this charge. And they go in their computer, the worker goes in the computer and goes, oh, sorry, I can't do that. And I'm like, oh, why can't you do that? Because I have the credit card, which means you should refund me for the bags. And she says, well, I don't have the authority to do that. The computer program tells me that I'm not allowed. And I'm not going to yell at her because she's not telling me a lie. She actually doesn't have the authority to change what the computer told her to do. But the computer is run by a program that's what? Programmed by who? Embedded with the ideology to achieve what? This is just a tiny microcosm, my own obvious personal frustration with what's going to happen large scale. Our entire society is going to be run on this premise that we as people are kind of just the face-to-face administrative minions of an AI that makes the rules that we have no capacity to change.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And if you read the work that's been done by the World Economic Forum and other big left-wing globalist organizations on AI, they're very clear that if you can design AI from the start so that it has our values in it, then we can they'll say make the world a better place, but what they mean is make the world in the image of them. By using artificial intelligence through AI, they can do this. And this sounds weird and conspiratorial and something that might be off into the future, but it is already happening, as you said. Banking, for example, already relies heavily on AI systems for loan approvals and things like that. The judicial system, this always shocks people when they hear this, but there are many, many jurisdictions throughout the country when they're doing sentencing, criminal sentencing. People have been convicted, they're doing criminal sentencing, they need sentencing recommendations. They turn to artificial intelligence to provide them with a quote unquote unbiased. This is absolutely true. In fact, the left is one of the biggest opponents of this in many places because they think that the AI has been designed using racist data and things like that. But this already exists. It's been around for a long time.
I can't even believe that. I can't. Yeah. Okay. And now talk to me how this applies, by the way. So there's another part of these sustainable development goals, which are basically just the policy platforms of Agenda 2030 that has to do with vaccine technology. I think they call it novel vaccine technology and a digital ID. This sounds to me, Justin, like a global vaccine passport.
Yeah. Well, they've been very clear that eventually that's where they want to go. They want to have, in the event of a future pandemic, they talk about what's going to happen when the next pandemic strikes. It's inevitable. They say things like this all the time. What do we need? Well, you need digital IDs. You need sometimes the digital IDs. How do we design them? Do we build them on blockchain? That's the kind of stuff they usually talk about is how do they design these digital IDs of the future, not whether we should have them
assuming that they're already going to be a reality. Like we've established that they're coming. How are we going to implement it?
Yeah, exactly. And then to couple those things with all sorts of really creepy facial recognition technology, which they've started rolling out in a lot of countries, including here in the United States. Yeah. There are a lot of TSA centers now that use facial recognition technology.
And I love the little sign they put underneath that, by the way. They're like, we don't save your picture. We delete it as soon as we've taken it. And I'm like, okay, bro.
Yeah, I know. How stupid do you think we are?
Right.
I know. It's incredible. The world that is being built is the stuff out of 1984. Like we're living it now. Like that's what we're living. We're living in an Orwellian nightmare starting to happen. And it's only going to continue to get worse if the Biden-Harris administration push us further and further down this road. The last 16 years, we have had 12 years of far left-wing Democratic presidents who have been trying, globalists, all of them, who have been tying us closer and closer to the United Nations through the Paris Climate Agreement, through this pact for the future, and a million other things that you've never even heard of. And Kamala Harris the goal for her is going to be to finish the job. That's the goal. And if Donald Trump becomes president, a lot of this stuff is going to stop. And they know that. And I don't think it's a mistake. And I'll say this summit for the future was planned years ago for specifically this moment in time, which just so happens to be 6 weeks before the election, the presidential election. Why did they do that? Why that period of time? They started the planning once Joe Biden became president. They planned it specifically for this period of time because this is the fail-safe if everything goes wrong. If Donald Trump becomes president, at least they've built all this infrastructure. They've started getting it into place. It's going to be hard for him to rip it down. That's what this is. And if he loses, then great. Then we just continue building on top of this, and the transformation of society, by the time a Republican comes back into power, it's already happened. It's too late. We're too far down the road. I really believe that's what's going on here.
It's terrifying to watch this unfold. I would say there's a tiny shred of hope and all of the dystopian things that we've been discussing, that they watered down the emergency platform just enough. I think the phrase you used was they kicked the can down the road. They want to achieve this. They plan to achieve this. They will achieve this unless enough of us speak out against it, unless enough of us understand what the agenda is and how they're trying to accomplish it, speak out against it so that they are forced to keep pushing it down the line until we do elect a Republican who says absolutely not to globalism. But I liked what you said before when you said this sounds conspiratorial. It sounds like, in a sense, we say one world government and we say ha-ha with it because it sounds conspiratorial, but it is. That's the thing. It is a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy theory, but it is a conspiracy. There are people on the other side of the ideological spectrum compared to us and the majority of people that are watching. I know there are some leftists, and I hope you know we're on to you, the people that are watching. But they're on the other side of the political spectrum, and they believe in very different things than we do. They don't believe in the American ideals. They don't believe in Judeo-Christian values. They don't believe in the value of humanity itself. And they are conspiring to take down the United States because we are a beacon of all of those things. And if we don't acknowledge the reality of what they're trying to do, then it's going to be upon us before we have a chance to stop it.
Yeah, there's almost nothing that I've said today that you can't find on the United Nations website.
Right.
Like, you can just go to the United Nations website and you can look all this stuff up. If you just want the quick and dirty place to go to the United Nations website, go to the Pact for the Future, Summit of the Future part of the website. It's not hard to find. And just look up the policy brief that was published by the UN Secretary General, still on the website, about the emergency platform. And just read that. If you read nothing else, just read that, and it will prove to you that everything that we're saying is more than possible, because if they're willing to support that crazy policy, if that's what the UN Secretary General is pushing for, then everything else seems less than that. We're talking about giving vast emergency powers to the UN Secretary General,
who proposed himself, by the way.
Dictator.
He proposed himself to give himself emergency powers. That should be a tip-off. And this is also a good way to weed out rhino politicians who won't actually fight against the globalist agenda, who are uniparty politicians, if you will, because if you ask them their views on this and they dismiss you because they don't want to be associated with such conspiracy theories, then they're not going to be fighters against it. They are, in fact, at least nonchalant about it, if not complicit with this agenda. Justin Haskins, your work, as always, is outstanding. Thank you for joining us today. And you can tell everyone where they can find you on X.
Yeah, at Justin T. Haskins.
Thanks
for having me, Liz.
Of course. See you soon.
Bye.
We are 39 days from the election. We're already in what AOC calls election season. This is the kind of stuff that voters need to know. It doesn't matter what you think of Donald Trump. It doesn't even matter if you like Kamala Harris, although it's hard for me to imagine that anyone could like Kamala Harris. What matters is the policies that they embrace. Kamala Harris embraces policies like this globalist takeover. So share this episode. Share this with people that you know, family members and friends and coworkers who are on the fence. Because I don't know very many people outside of elitists who want this to happen. And it's verifiable. You can go to the UN website. You can fact check everything to your heart's content, and I encourage you to do so. Also, make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter. We just launched it this past week. Go to LizWheelerNewsletter.com, drop your email in, stay up to date on everything you need to know for the next 39 days. And I have a question for you guys before we go. My question is this. If there was just one thing that you wish every voter in our country could know before the election, just one thing, what would that one thing be? Comment in the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, drop it there. If you're watching on Apple, drop it in the review section. You can email me. You can drop it on social media. Communicate in any forum, on any social network that you have, on blazetv.com. Let me know what that one thing is, because it's really important that we get those things in front of voters before they cast their ballots. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.